The emergency room at night had its own gravity, not loud enough to feel alive, not quiet enough to rest. Fluorescent lights hummed above scuffed linoleum. A monitor beeped in a slow, patient rhythm that no one consciously heard anymore. The smell of antiseptic clung to everything, hands, curtains, the air itself. The aide moved through it without sound. His badge read, "Ear Aide" in faded black letters. The plastic was scratched, the clip bent slightly inward, as if it had been caught on something hard and never fixed. He wore the same scrubs as the others, but his were older, thinner at the knees. Sleeves rolled once, precise, even. He wiped down a gurney already marked clean, checked the brake with his foot. It held. He nodded once, to no one, and pushed it back into place. Around him, the night shift unfolded in fragments. A drunk man argued with triage about a lost phone. A woman sat rigid in a chair, holding her wrist with both hands, eyes locked on the floor. A nurse leaned against the counter, rubbing her temples, while a resident scrolled through labs too fast to read. No one spoke to the aide unless they needed something moved. "Room 3 needs fresh sheets," a nurse said without looking up. He was already halfway there. Inside room 3, the patient slept under dimmed lights, chest rising unevenly. The aide moved carefully, folding soiled linens inward, never brushing the patient's skin. He noticed the angle of the foreline, the way the tape had started to peel. He fixed it, gently, without writing anything down. When he stepped back into the hall, a stretcher burst through the double doors too fast. He caught the corner instinctively, slowing it before it hit the wall. The paramedic barely noticed. "Thanks," the man said, already turning away. The aide didn't respond. He reset the door, checked the hinge, and watched the stretcher disappear down the corridor. His eyes followed it longer than necessary, counting steps, noting how many staff moved with it, how many did not, understaffed. Again. He returned to the supply room, scanned the shelves. Gauze was low, saline was stacked wrong, labels facing inward, slowing access. He fixed it, quiet corrections, small efficiencies that saved seconds no one tracked. At the nurse's station, voices overlapped. Trauma from the highways 10 minutes out. Psych still backed up. Security said they're short tonight. Someone laughed, tired and thin. The aide paused at the edge of the counter, holding a clipboard he wasn't assigned to carry. He listened, not to the words, to the gaps between them, to what wasn't being said. 10 minutes out meant chaos in 12. Security short meant doors that would not be covered. The psych backlog meant volatile patients staying longer than planned. He looked down the main hallway. Long, straight, too open. He adjusted a cart by 2 inches, angling it closer to the wall. It created a narrower passage, subtle. Anyone moving fast would slow without knowing why. A doctor brushed past him and stopped. "Can you mop by intake?" she said. "There's blood." "Yes, doctor." She was already gone. As he filled the bucket, he noticed the way his hands moved, steady, economical, no wasted motion, the kind learned over repetition, not training videos. He scrubbed until the floor reflected light again, then wiped the soles of his shoes before stepping back into the hall. The clock above triage ticked over to 1:17. A security guard leaned against the wall near the entrance, scrolling on his phone. Young, vest too loose, radio volume low. The aide passed him and slowed, just enough. "Sir," he said quietly, not urgent, "your radio." The guard looked up, annoyed. "What about it?" "It's turned down." The guard glanced at it, scoffed, turned it up 1 notch. "Happy?" "Yes, sir." The aide kept walking. He did not look back, but he listened. The radio crackled once, then fell silent again, still too low. In Trauma Bay 2, a nurse struggled to lift a patient alone. The aide was there before she asked, positioning himself opposite her, matching her pace. They lifted together, no strain, no comment. "Thanks," she said, breathless. He nodded and stepped away. She watched him go for a moment, frowning, then turned back to her chart. The ER breathed. In, out, in. Then the automatic doors slid open again. A man stumbled inside, supported by another who was already backing away. Blood soaked through the first man's jacket, dark and spreading. Not arterial. Not yet. "Help," the man said. His voice was flat, controlled too well for the amount of blood he was losing. The aide stopped moving. Everyone else reacted at once. "Get him on a bed. Call trauma. Where's security?" The aide stepped forward, catching the man as his knees buckled. He lowered him, carefully, guiding him to sit instead of fall. His fingers pressed briefly at the wound through fabric. Testing, confirming. "Don't remove the jacket," he said softly to the nearest nurse. She hesitated. "We need access." "Not yet," he replied, calm. "Pressure first." She looked at him, irritation flashing, then saw the blood slow beneath his hand. She nodded. The other man who had brought him in was already gone. The aide noticed that too. As the patient was moved, the aide's eyes tracked the entrance, the hallway beyond, the reflection in the glass. He noted the way the security guard had straightened, suddenly alert, the way the air felt heavier, charged. This was not routine. No one asked his opinion. No one asked his name. But when the trauma doors closed, and the hallway filled with noise again, the aide did not return to his mop. He stood still for 3 seconds. Long enough to decide. Then he began moving carts, just enough to change lines of sight. He closed one unused door. He opened another and wedged it with a trash can, propping it at an angle that would slow anyone entering without stopping, staff who knew the space. Small things, invisible things. The clock ticked forward. Somewhere deep in the hospital, an alarm chirped once and stopped. The aide looked up, and for the first time that night, his expression changed. Not fear, not urgency, recognition, the kind that came from having seen this shape of silence before. He adjusted his badge, straightened his sleeves, and went back to work as the emergency room drifted closer to something it did not yet understand. The patient from intake was stabilized, barely. A through-and-through wound, low caliber, clean entry, cleaner exit. No debris, no panic. The kind of injury that came from someone who knew where to aim, or where not to. The aide stood against the wall outside Trauma Bay 2, holding a folded blanket. No one had asked for it. He waited anyway. Inside, the doctor spoke in clipped phrases. Pressure holding. Vitals. Stable but guarded. The aide listened, head slightly tilted, eyes unfocused. He wasn't following the medicine. He was following the rhythm. How fast they moved. Where they hesitated. Too cautious for an accident. Too calm for a mugging. A nurse stepped out and nearly collided with him. "Sorry," she said automatically. He stepped aside. "Is he conscious?" She blinked. "Yeah. Why? No reason." She walked off, already forgetting the question. Down the hall, the security guard's radio crackled. Too late, too sudden. "All units, we have—" Static swallowed the rest. The aide's eyes moved to the ceiling, tracking the location of the nearest speaker. Old system. Dead zones everywhere. A stretcher rolled past, empty, pushed too fast. Another followed, this one with a woman clutching her abdomen, blood seeping between her fingers. Different injury, same direction of travel, same 10-minute window. The aide stepped into her path and slowed the stretcher with one hand. "Where did this happen?" he asked her gently. She swallowed. "Parking lot. Which one?" She hesitated. "South." He nodded and stepped back. South lot fed directly into the service corridor. Poor lighting. One camera that hadn't worked in months. He knew because he had filed the maintenance request himself. Twice, at the nurse's station, voices rose. "That's the second one. Call it in." "I did. Aide city units are tied up." The aide placed the folded blanket on the counter and leaned in slightly. "Should we limit entry through the south doors?" he asked. The charge nurse looked at him, surprised he was speaking at all. "They're for staff," she said. "We can't just—" "Security is short," he replied, "and we're already diverting attention." She frowned, irritation edging in. "We'll manage. Please go back to your assignment." "Yes, ma'am." He stepped away without argument. But 2 minutes later, the south doors were no longer fully open. A supply cart sat just inside, positioned so they would only open halfway unless pushed with intent. Anyone moving fast would have to slow. A third patient arrived. This one walked in on his own. No blood visible, hands shaking too much for shock, eyes scanning instead of pleading. The aide noticed the man's shoes first. Mud on the sides, not the soles. Recently kneeling, not here. The man stopped at triage and spoke too clearly. "I need help," he said. "Someone's been shot." The triage nurse asked the standard questions. The man answered all of them, too well, rehearsed cadence. He kept glancing toward the trauma bays. The aide stood behind him unseen and watched his hands. No tremor when he adjusted his jacket. No hesitation when he touched his phone. Calm breathing, elevated heart rate, but controlled. The aide stepped closer to the counter and spoke softly, as if to the nurse. "There's a spill in hallway C," he said. "I can take care of it." The nurse waved him off without looking. Later, He stayed anyway. When the man turned slightly, the aide caught a glimpse beneath the jacket. A bulge, wrong shape, wrong placement for a hone or wallet. The jacket wasn't buttoned. It was positioned. The aide moved back a step, placing himself between the man and the open corridor, not blocking, just occupying space. The man noticed. His eyes flicked down, then back up. "Do you work here?" the man asked. "Yes," the aide replied. "Where do they take gunshot victims?" The aide didn't answer immediately. He looked past the man, toward the entrance, where the automatic doors slid open again. 2 more people entered, one limping, one carrying him. Blood again. Same pattern, same calm. The aide turned back. "Trauma bays are full," he said. "Not entirely true. Close enough." The man's jaw tightened for half a second. "I'll wait," he said. The aide nodded and stepped away. He did not leave the area. Instead, he walked to the linen cart and repositioned it so it partially blocked the direct line of sight down the main hall. He adjusted a chair, angling it toward the wall. He opened a side door that led to a short dead-end corridor and switched on the light, creating the illusion of activity. Small things. Invisible things. The charge nurse finally looked up. "Why is this cart here?" "I'm restocking," the aide said. She sighed. "Just don't block the hallway." "I won't." He didn't. Not completely. Another radio crackle. Louder this time. Possible active. Static. Silence. The aide closed his eyes for one breath. Active what? He moved to the wall phone near radiology and picked it up. The line was dead. He hung it back carefully, then checked the one near pediatrics. It worked. For now. A resident rushed past him, pale. "We're calling a partial lockdown." "Which doors?" the aide asked. The resident slowed, confused. "What? Which doors are closing?" I don't know. Security handles that." The aide nodded. "Thank you." He walked toward security. The young guard was standing straighter now, phone gone, radio pressed to his ear. "They're saying multiple shooters," the guard said, eyes wide, but no confirmation. "Which doors are you covering?" the aide asked. "All of them," the guard said weakly. The aide looked at him for a long moment, not judging, measuring. "You can't," he said quietly. "Cover north and pediatrics. I'll watch south." The guard hesitated. "You're not—" "I'm here," the aide said. "So are they—" A scream echoed from down the hall, short, cut off. The guard swallowed. "Okay." He moved. The aide exhaled slowly and took position near the south entrance, just out of direct sight. He placed his back to the wall, eyes on reflections, ears open. The man at triage shifted his weight. His hand brushed the inside of his jacket. The aide stepped forward, just enough to be noticed. "Sir," he said calmly, "please remain where you are." The man looked at him and smiled thinly. "Or what?" he asked. Nothing in the aide's face changed. "Or people get hurt sooner than they have to," he replied. The smile faded. Around them, the emergency room continued its work. Charts, monitors, footsteps, unaware that the margin for error had narrowed to inches. The aide stood still, holding space, buying time. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for anything. He simply refused to move. And that, more than anything, unsettled the man in front of him. The partial lockdown was announced twice, once over the intercom, clipped and uncertain, once through panic, spreading faster than Instructio. NS ever could. "Attention all staff. This is a partial lockdown. Please secure." The message cut out mid-sentence. The speakers clicked, then went silent. The aide did not look up. He was already moving. The south entrance doors slid open again, admitting a rush of cold air and noise from outside, sirens in the distance, tires screeching, voices raised too loud to be useful. The 2 men who entered did not rush. They walked. One supported the other, arm around his shoulder, blood smeared across both of them. The aide stepped aside just enough to let them pass, eyes tracking hands, posture, breath. The man who appeared injured was not. His weight distribution was wrong. He leaned, but not onto the wound. His free hand stayed clear, ready. Behind them, the man from triage shifted position, lining himself with the corridor. 3 points. Triangulation without words. The aide closed the distance between himself and the group by 1 step. "Trauma is full," he said calmly. "You'll need to wait here." The man pretending to be injured grimaced. "I'm bleeding." "Yes," the aide replied. "You are—" He reached out, pressing the man gently but firmly back toward a chair. His fingers found the pressure point just above the clavicle, not enough to drop him, just enough to remind the body of limits. The man stiffened. "Don't touch me," he snapped. "I won't," the aide said, withdrawing his hand. "Sit." The command was quiet, almost polite. For half a second, it worked. Then the man at triage moved. He reached inside his jacket. The aide stepped forward at the same moment. Not lunging, not dramatic. He simply occupied the space between the man and the hallway, forcing the movement wide and D of straight. The gun came out crooked. A shot went off. The sound was flat, contained by walls and bodies. Plaster exploded from the ceiling. Someone screamed. A monitor alarm spiked and wailed. The aide grabbed the man's wrist with both hands and turned, not fast but precise. The gun clattered to the floor. The man stumbled, shocked more than hurt. The aide drove him backward into the wall and held him there, forearm across the chest, pinning, without choking. "Drop," he said to no one in particular. The second man froze. His eyes darted. He hadn't expected resistance here. Not like this. The aide felt the tremor in the man he was holding. Fear now. Real. Security arrived too late and too loud. "Gun! Get down!" The guard raised his weapon, shaking. "No," the aide said sharply. "Hold." The guard hesitated, confused by the authority in the voice, then lowered the muzzle a fraction. The second man bolted. He ran toward the service corridor. The aide released his hold and turned, already moving. He did not chase. He cut. He took the side corridor he had opened earlier, lights still on, the illusion intact. He reached the junction first and shoved a cart across the passage, blocking it just enough. The man slammed into it, stumbled, fell hard. The aide was there before he could rise. He placed a knee on the man's shoulder, not his spine. His hand pressed the head down, face turned away from the floor to keep the airway clear. "Stay," he said. The man struggled once, twice, then stopped. Footsteps thundered behind them, more security, a nurse, a doctor shouting for help. The aide kept his knee in place until hands replaced his. He stood, breathing steady, and stepped back. "Ah." "Owned him. The emergency room had fractured." Patients cried. Staff shouted. Someone sobbed in a corner, hands over their ears. Blood streaked the floor where the first shot had struck. The intercom crackled again. "All staff, full lockdown. Repeat, full lockdown." Too late. The aide walked back toward the main hall, scanning as he went. He checked corners, doorways, reflections. The man he had first restrained was on the floor now, cuffed, screaming incoherently. The gun lay several feet away, untouched. A doctor grabbed the aide's arm. "What the hell just happened?" she demanded. "South entrance compromise," the aide replied. "At least one more unaccounted for." Her face strained of color. "One more?" "Yes." She looked past him, suddenly seeing the room differently. "We need to evacuate." "No," the aide said. She stared at him. "You're an aide." "Yes, but if you move people now, you create targets," he said. "You shelter, you lock, you wait." Security radios burst to life, overlapping, panicked. "We lost him." He went toward imaging, shots fired near. The aide closed his eyes briefly, mapping the hospital from memory. Imaging connected to radiology. Radiology to pediatrics, long halls, blind turns, children. He opened his eyes and looked at the charge nurse. "Lock pediatrics," he said. "Now," she hesitated. "That's not protocol." "Do it," he said quietly. She did. The aide turned and headed down the hall at a controlled pace, not running, not hiding. He picked up the fallen gun as he passed and handed it to security without comment. Behind him, the emergency room descended into controlled chaos. Ahead of him, somewhere in the hospital, the final piece of the threat was still moving, and the lockdown, meant to stop everything, had already failed. The hospital changed once the lockdown failed, not in noise, there was already plenty of that, but in posture. Doors were closed now, some locked, some jammed with whatever hands could find. Curtains were pulled where no curtains were meant to stop anything. Staff moved faster but thought less, urgency replacing order. The aide moved against that current. He slowed instead. His footsteps were measured, heel to toe, just loud enough to sound like anyone else doing their job. He kept to the right side of the corridor, where reflections in glass panels gave him angles the hallway itself did not. Radiology was ahead, darker than the ER, fewer people, worse acoustics, A crash echoed from somewhere beyond imaging, metal on tile, followed by a short, sharp cry that cut off too quickly. The aide stopped. He didn't rush toward the sound. He waited for the second one. It came, a chair scraping, a breath fast and uneven trying to quiet itself. The aide exhaled slowly and stepped forward. He reached the corner just short of radiology and paused, back to the wall. He loosened his shoulders, rolled his neck once. Not from tension, from habit. A nurse lay on the floor inside imaging, on her side, hands clutched to her stomach. Blood soaked through her scrubs. She was conscious. Barely. The aide scanned past her first. The man stood near the CT console, weapon up, breathing hard. His eyes were wide now. The calm was gone. Sweat ran down his temple, darkening the collar of his jacket. He hadn't expected resistance. He hadn't expected delay. He certainly hadn't expected to be bleeding from the forearm, where a shard of broken chair leg had torn through skin. He turned when the aide stepped into view. "Don't," the man said. His voice shook. "Don't come any closer." The aide stopped 3 meters away, hands open. "Empty." "I'm not," he said. The man's eyes flicked to the nurse on the floor, then back to the aide. "She tried to stop me," he said, as if that explained everything. "She did her job," the aide replied. "Then she picked the wrong time." The aide nodded once. "Maybe." The man frowned. The lack of argument unsettled him. "Where are the kids?" the man demanded. "I know this place. I know where they are." "You're wrong," the aide said calmly. The man laughed, sharp and broken. "You think you can lie to me? I think you're bleeding," the aide replied. "And tired." The man tightened his grip on the weapon. "I said don't come closer." "I won't," the aide said again. "But you don't want to do this here." "Why not?" the man snapped. "Everyone's watching anyway." "No," the aide said. "No one is." The man hesitated, confused. The aide took one small step to the side, not forward. It shifted the man's line of fire away from the nurse without him realizing why. "You're alone now," the aide continued. "The others failed. The plan failed. You're improvising. You don't know anything about the plan," the man said. The aide's eyes flicked briefly to the man's shoes. Mud again. "Same pattern." "South lot," he said quietly. "Service corridor. 2 entries, 1 fallback. You lost the fallback." The man's face changed. Not fear. Recognition. "Who are you?" he asked. The aide did not answer. Instead, he crouched slowly, keeping his hands visible, and slid the nurse's fallen ID badge across the floor toward the man. "You're standing between her and help," he said. "You move, she bleeds out. You stay, you bleed out." The man glanced down at the badge, then at his arm. Blood dripped onto the tile, each drop louder than it should have been. "I can still finish this," the man said, but his voice no longer believed it. "Not tonight," the aide replied. Silence stretched. Somewhere far away a child cried, muffled, behind walls. The man's jaw tightened. "They don't deserve it," he said suddenly. "People like them, they don't pay for anything." The aide's expression did not change. "I'm not here to argue justice," he said. "I'm here to stop you." The man raised the weapon again, desperation overriding calculation. The aide moved, not fast, efficient. He closed the distance in 2 steps, knocked the barrel aside with the edge of his hand, and drove his shoulder into the man's chest. They hit the console hard. The weapon fired once into the ceiling, showering dust and sparks. The aide twisted the man's wrist, using the console as leverage, until the weapon fell. He pinned the man there, forearm across the throat, not crushing, just enough to control. The man struggled wildly now. All discipline gone. "Stop," the aide said once. The man did not. The aide shifted his weight and applied pressure to a nerve cluster beneath the jaw. The man's body locked, then sagged, breath coming in ragged gasps. The aide held him until the struggle drained out completely. Then he lowered him to the floor, controlled, careful not to let the man's head strike tile. He turned immediately to the nurse. "She's still breathing," he said to no one. Already pressing down on the wound, elevating he legs with his foot. "Call it in. Trauma team. Now." A resident appeared at the doorway, frozen. "Move," the aide said, not unkindly. The resident moved. Security arrived moments later, weapons raised, shouting orders that no longer mattered. The aide stepped back, hands visible, giving them the scene. "He's alive," the aide said. "Disarmed. Secondary threat neutralized." One of the guards stared at him. How did you?" The aide was already turning away. As he walked back into the corridor, the weight of the moment pressed down. Not adrenaline, not triumph. Cost. The nurse's blood on his hands. The sound of that single shot echoing where it could have gone very differently. He washed his hands at the nearest sink, methodical, thorough. He scrubbed until the water ran clear. Then he looked up at his reflection. For a fraction of a second, the hospital aide was gone, replaced by something older, harder, shaped by places far from fluorescent lights. He blinked. The reflection softened, and he stepped back into the hall as the hospital braced for what came next. The threat was neutralized, but the crisis was not over. The aide knew the difference. Radiology filled with voices, security coordinating, doctors giving orders, someone crying quietly in a corner. The nurse was rushed past him on a stretcher, pale, alive. He watched until the doors closed, then turned away. He did not follow the noise. He went the other direction. Containment was not about stopping one person. It was about holding the space until it stopped bleeding. He walked the corridors between radiology and pediatrics, checking doors with light pressure. Locked, jammed, one that looked closed but wasn't. He jedged it with a careful nudge of a chair leg beneath the handle. Improvised. Reliable enough. The intercom crackled again. All units, situation contained. Remain in lockdown until further notice. Contained was a dangerous word. It made people move too soon. He reached the pediatrics wing. The doors were shut, lights dimmed. A handmade sign taped crookedly to the glass read lockdown in thick marker. A nurse stood just inside, gripping a phone with white knuckles. She saw him through the glass and shook her head violently. He raised one hand, palm out, and waited. After a moment, she cracked the door just enough to speak. "Is it over?" she whispered. "Not yet," he replied. "But it's quieter." Her shoulders sagged. "We have 12 kids in here." "I know," he said. "How do you know? I counted earlier." She stared at him, then nodded slowly. "What do you need?" "Nothing," he said. "You're doing it right. Keep the lights low. No movement unless you hear my voice." "Your voice?" she asked. He met her eyes. "Yes." She hesitated, then closed the door again. He stepped back into the corridor and leaned against a wall for the first time that night. Not from fatigue, from timing. He needed to be still long enough to listen. The hospital breathed around him. Air handlers cycling, distant alarms, radios murmuring half-coherent updates. Outside, sirens layered over each other. Closer now. He closed his eyes and ran the map again. Secure but fragile. Radiology compromised but contained. Pediatrics locked down. ICU upstairs, unknown. Surgical wing, unknown. Too many unknowns. He moved again. At the base of the stairwell he encountered a group of staff huddled together. 3 nurses on resident. 1 janitor. They looked at him as if he were part of the wall. "Stay here," he said. One nurse shook her head. "We need to get to ICU." "Not yet," he replied. "You'll block the stairwell." "We can't just wait," the resident said, voice tight. The aide looked at him. Really looked. "You're shaking," he said. "If you fall, everyone behind you falls too." The resident swallowed and nodded. They stayed. The aide took the stairs alone, moving upward, one hand on the rail, careful not to let it clatter. At the next landing he stopped and listened. Footsteps above. Fast. Uncontrolled. He stepped back into the shadow just as a man burst down the stairs, hospital scrubs, blood on his sleeve, eyes wild. The aide caught him before he fell. "Easy," he said. "Easy." "I didn't do anything," the man babbled. "I didn't—" "I know," the aide said, steadying him. "You're safe here." The man's knees buckled. The aide lowered him to sit, then positioned him against the wall, out of the way. He stayed until the man's breathing slowed. Then he continued upward. By the time he reached the 2nd floor, the sirens outside had shifted. Fewer, more controlled, different cadence, professional. His radio, borrowed quietly from an empty security desk, chirped, "Command to hospital interior." "Identify." The aide paused. "Interior," he replied. A beat of silence. "Say again." "Interior," he repeated. "South access compromised earlier. Threat neutralized inside radiology. Lockdown holding." Another pause. "Longer this time." "Who am I speaking with?" the voice asked. The aide looked down at his badge. Aide." He pressed the radio closer. "Someone who knows the building," he said. The voice on other end changed. Subtle but unmistakable. "Stand by." The aide leaned against the stairwell wall and waited. Not tense. Ready. Below him, the hospital held together by doors, carts, and the quiet decisions of people who would never be named. Above him, help was finally arriving, not to save the night, but to take it from here. And when the radio spoke again, it did not ask him to step aside. It asked him where to deploy. The radio stayed quiet for 12 seconds, long enough for the aide to understand what the silence meant. They were listening now. He pressed the transmit button again. ICU and surgical wing status unknown. Pediatrics locked and holding. South entrance compromised but contained. Recommend perimeter before interior sweep. A pause, then copy, interior. Units en route. Units, plural. He clipped the radio to his waistband and started down the second-floor corridor toward surgery. The lights here were dimmed for night procedures, casting long shadows that hid corners too well. He moved along the wall, fingertips brushing door frames as he passed, grounding himself in the space. A metal tray clattered somewhere ahead. He stopped. Another sound followed, fabric against tile. Someone moving low, trying not to be heard. He did not advance. He waited, counting breaths. The figure emerged from a supply room, a young man in hospital scrubs that did not fit him well, sleeves too long, pants cinched with a knot. He carried a scalpel in one hand, grip wrong, blade angled inward. The man froze when he saw the aide. Neither spoke. The aide's eyes went to the scalpel, then to the man's face, pale, sweating, pupils blown. This one was not trained. This one was afraid. "Put it down," the aide said. The man shook his head. "They said I had to. They said they'd—" "I know," the aide replied. "Put it down anyway." The man's breathing hitched. "I can't." The aide stepped closer, slow, deliberate, closing the distance without forcing it. "You're not trapped," he said. "You think you are. You're not—" The man's hand trembled. The scalpel wavered. "I don't want to hurt anyone," he whispered. "I believe you," the aide said. He was close enough now to see the tear tracks cutting through sweat. "Then don't," he said. The scalpel slipped from the man's fingers and clattered to the floor. The man sagged forward, knees giving out. The aide caught him and guided him down, easing him into a sitting position against the wall. He stayed until the man's breathing slowed, then took the radio. "Interior to command," he said quietly. "One coerced accomplice in surgical corridor. Disarmed. Alive. Copy," the voice replied. "No surprise. Just confirmation." The aide stood and continued on. At the end of the corridor, he found the pressure point he had been avoiding. The ICU doors were ajar. Inside, machines hummed steadily, keeping time for bodies that could not. A nurse lay slumped against a workstation, blood seeping from her shoulder. 2 patients' rooms stood open. Beds empty. He felt it then. Not panic. Wait. He knelt beside the nurse, checked her pulse. Strong. Bleeding controlled with a makeshift bandage she had applied herself. "You did well," he said. Her eyes fluttered open. "They took them," she whispered. "Said they needed leverage. Which way?" he asked. She lifted a shaking hand and pointed toward the service elevators. He closed his eyes, Bree. Fly. Leverage meant time pressure. Hostages meant escalation. This was the moment where speed tempted recklessness. He stood and keyed the radio. "They have patients," he said, moving toward service elevators, non-ambulatory. "Recommend elevator lockdown and stairwell control." The reply came instantly. "Already moving. Good." He jogged now, not running, but faster than before. The service elevators sat at the junction of 3 corridors, a bad place to lose control. He reached them just as the doors slid shut. Inside, through the narrow window, he saw a man's face. Older, calm. This one was different. The elevator began to descend. The aide hit the emergency stop. The elevator jolted and halted between floors. A shout echoed from inside. He pressed the intercom. "It's over," he said. "Open the doors." A laugh crackled back through the speaker. "You're persistent." "Yes," the aide said. "And you're out of options. You think those men outside care about these patients?" the voice replied. "They'll breach. They always do." "Not tonight," the aide said. Silence stretched. "What's your name?" the voice asked. The aide did not answer. Instead, he pressed his forehead lightly against the cool metal of the elevator doors and listened, to the breathing inside, to the machines keeping people alive, to the distant thrum of vehicles arriving outside. "You stop now," he said softly, "and everyone walks out. And if I don't, then I stay here," the aide replied, "and so do you." The doors remained closed. Time passed. 30 seconds. A minute. Finally a click. The doors parted just enough to see inside. The man stood with his hands raised. The patients lay strapped to gurneys behin. Him, alive, scared. The aide did not rush. He waited for the man to step out first. When he did, the aide guided him to the floor and held him there until footsteps thundered up the stairs. Heavy, synchronized, disciplined. The hospital trembled as something larger took hold of the night. The aide released the man and stepped back, heart steady, hand still. The cost had been paid. Blood, fear, time. Now came the part where he gave the night away. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the service corridor. Not rushed, not loud, controlled. The aide did not turn right away. He stayed where he was, one hand resting lightly on the elevator frame, feeling the vibration of machinery beneath his palm. The patients behind him were alive, breathing, machines steady again. That was enough, for now. Interior, a voice said from behind him. Calm, older, used to being obeyed without raising volume. Step clear. The aide complied without hesitation. He stepped to the side, hands visible, posture neutral. 4 men moved past him. They wore no hospital markings, no obvious insignia. Their clothing was plain, functional, unremarkable, except for how it fit and how they moved. Each covered a different angle without speaking. One knelt immediately to assess the patients, fingers checking lines, restraints, vitals. They worked fast, quiet. The aide watched them for only a second before looking away. This was their space now. A 5th man approached him slowly, taller than the others, beard flecked with grey. His eyes took everything in. The blood on the floor, the jammed elevator doors, the aide's stance. You did well, the man said. The aide did not respond. You could have ended this fast. The man continued. At radiology. At the stairs. Even here. Yes, the aide said. Why didn't you? The aide looked past him, toward the ICU doors where the wounded nurse was being treated now, toward pediatrics 2 floors below. Because faster would have cost someone who didn't choose to be here, he said. The man studied him. Not testing. Recognizing. One of the operators spoke quietly into a radio. All hostiles accounted for. Patients secure. The corridor exhaled. Sirens outside faded, replaced by engines idling in disciplined formation. Doors at the far end of the hospital opened and closed in sequence, sealing, then releasing, space by space. The night was being dismantled carefully. The man in charge lowered his voice. They're asking for you by name. The aide finally looked at him. I don't have one here, he said. The man's mouth tightened slightly, not in frustration but respect. They'll figure it out anyway, he said. Convoy's already rolling. Rangers? The word hung in the air, heavy but unadorned. The aide felt it then. Not pride, not relief. Distance. I don't need to meet them, he said. You already did, the man replied. A long time ago. A stretcher rolled past them, patients alive, hands gripping blankets. One of them reached out weakly, fingers brushing the aide's sleeve. Thank you, the patient whispered. The aide nodded once. Nothing more. A junior operator approached, helmet tucked under his arm. Sir, command wants confirmation. Is it him? The man looked at the aide. The aide shook his head slightly. No, the man said. He's hospital staff. The operator hesitated, then nodded and walked away. The aide let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That's the line, he said quietly. I don't cross it anymore. The man considered him for a long moment. Then we'll finish without you, he said. As requested. The aide nodded. The Rangers moved out in a fluid sweep, boots whispering against tile, weapons lowered now but ready. They did not look at the aide again. They did not need to. When the corridor emptied, the hospital noise returned in fragments. Intercoms, rolling carts, murmured voices trying to return to normal. The aide walked back toward the ER alone. As he passed the nurse's station, someone started to speak to him, then stopped. Unsure how to address him now. He picked up a stack of unused gloves from the counter and carried them to the supply room. Routine. In the quiet, the weight finally settled. Not dramatic, not crushing. Just heavy. And carried. The convoy arrived without ceremony. No sirens, no shouted commands, just engines settling into place outside the hospital. Low, even, controlled. The sound filtered through concrete and glass like distant thunder that never quite reached the storm. Inside, the aide felt the shift before anyone announced it. Radios stopped overlapping. Footsteps synchronized. People began waiting for instructions instead of inventing them. He was back in the ER when the first ranger stepped through the staff entrance. Not in full kit, no helmet, weapon slung low, finger nowhere near the trigger. He scanned the room once, took in bloodstains, overturned carts, the faces of staff still running on adrenaline. His gaze landed on the Aide. It stayed there half a second longer than it should have. The Aide turned away first. He pushed a cart toward Hausek. Eeping stopped to wipe blood from a wall that no one else had noticed yet. He worked methodically, as if this were any other end-of-shift cleanup. Behind him, the ranger spoke quietly into his radio. Command, interior visual confirmed. A reply came instantly, filtered through the open channel. Confirm identity. The ranger did not answer right away. He watched the Aide lift a trash bag, tie it and set it aside. He noticed the way the Aide checked corners automatically as he moved, the way his shoulders never slumped. Yes, the ranger said finally. It's him. The radio went silent for a beat. Then put him on. The ranger approached slowly, stopping at a respectful distance. Sir, he said, voice level. Command is requesting. No, the Aide replied, without turning. The ranger hesitated. They're already rolling call signs. I'm on shift, the Aide said, and I'm done with that part of my life. The ranger glanced around. Staff were watching now, pretending not to. A nurse froze mid-chart. A doctor stood too still near the trauma doors. Understood, the ranger said. He lifted the radio anyway, thumb hovering over the transmit button. Command, he said. Negative on direct contact. Subject declined. Another pause. Longer this time. Copy, the voice replied. No argument, no pressure. Tell him we're glad he was here tonight. The ranger lowered the radio. The Aide finished tying the bag and finally turned. That's enough, he said quietly. The ranger nodded once. Yes, sir. The Aide stiffened slightly at the word, then let it pass. Outside, the convoy engines cut one by one. Rangers moved through the hospital perimeter with deliberate care, not searching now, confirming. Securing what the Aide had already held together, a nurse approached him hesitantly. They're asking what to put in the report, she said. About what happened. Write what you saw, the Aide replied. Nothing more. And you? He met her eyes. I cleaned. I moved patients. I followed instructions. She swallowed and nodded. A stretcher rolled past, empty now. Someone laughed softly, the sound breaking under its own weight. The night was releasing its grip. The ranger stepped back toward the exit, then paused. For what it's worth, he said, low enough that only the Aide could hear. They still use your playbook. The Aide allowed himself the smallest exhale. Then they don't need me, he said. The ranger smiled once, brief and private, then disappeared through the doors. The radio on the counter crackled again. Hospital frequency this time. All units, lockdown lifted. Resume standard operations. Standard. The Aide looked around the ER. New patients arriving, fresh charts, bloodstains already fading beneath cleaner. He returned the borrowed radio to the security desk and straightened the chair beside it. No one stopped him, no one saluted, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Morning arrived without announcement. The windows along the east side of the emergency room lightened from black to grey, then to a thin, colourless blue. The fluorescent lights stayed on anyway. No one bothered to turn them off yet. The Aide stood at the sink, washing his hands again, not because they were dirty, because the night was still on them. Water ran over his fingers, warm, steady. He scrubbed beneath his nails, dried carefully, and folded the paper towel before dropping it in the bin. The motions were exact, familiar. Ending rituals mattered. Behind him, the ER reorganized itself. Stretchers were returned, equipment logged back in, medications restocked, the controlled chaos of recovery, less visible than the crisis, but just as fragile. A doctor dictated notes into a recorder, voice hoarse. A nurse sat on the floor with her back to the wall, shoes off, eyes closed, breathing slowly. Security guards rotated out, replaced by city officers who looked uncomfortable inside the building they had arrived, too late to protect. The Aide walked past them all, pushing an empty linen cart. No one stopped him. The man who had been shot first, the one who had come in controlled and quiet, was moved past him toward imaging again. Alive. Stable. The Aide met his eyes briefly as the stretcher rolled by. The man looked away. That was fine. Near the nurse's station, a cluster of administrators had gat. Haired. Fresh clothes. Fresh faces. They spoke in low voices, already shaping language. Multiple coordinated assailants, rapid response from external units. Staff acted heroically. One of them noticed the aide standing nearby and frowned, trying to place him. "Did you see where environmental services went?" she asked. "I'm here," the aide replied. "Oh," she said, distracted. "Good. There's blood near radiology that still needs—" "I took care of it," he said. She nodded and turned back to her group. A police detective approached the charge nurse with a notepad. Questions were asked. Answers were given carefully, framed by shock and exhaustion. The detective's eyes kept drifting toward the aide, then away again, uncertain why. A nurse caught the aide's sleeve as he passed. "Hey," she said quietly. "They're asking who coordinated movement during lockdown." He looked at her. "They want a name." She hesitated. "I didn't give one." "Good," he said. "That wasn't—" She stopped herself. "You know what I mean." "Yes." She studied him for a long moment. "You could have done more, you know that, right?" "Yes, and you didn't—" "Yes." She nodded slowly. "Okay, that was all." Down the hall, the nurse from imaging, alive, bandaged, pale, was wheeled toward ICU. As she passed, her eyes found the aide. She lifted 2 fingers weakly in acknowledgement. He returned the gesture, just as small. Outside, the last of the Rangers were leaving. The aide watched through the glass doors as they moved in pairs toward unmarked vehicles. No hurry, no ceremony. One of them paused briefly, scanning the building one last time, then nodded to himself and climbed in. Engines started, one by one. Then gone. The hospital felt larger without them, more exposed, more honest. A janitor began mopping near intake, pushing water across tile that still bore faint shadows where blood had been. The aide stopped, watched the pattern, then stepped in to help reposition a sign so foot traffic would avoid the wet area. They worked side by side in silence. At 6:58, the day shift began to arrive. New scrubs, fresh coffee, confused looks at the tension still hanging in the air. "What happened?" someone asked. "Long night," a nurse replied. That was all the answer they got. The aide returned the linen cart to its place and checked the shelves one last time. Gauze restocked, saline facing outward, everything where it belonged. He walked to the locker room and changed slowly, folding his scrubs instead of tossing them in the bin. There was blood on the knee. He noted it without reaction. When he stepped back out, dressed in plain clothes, his badge no longer visible, the hospital barely noticed the subtraction. At the exit, the security guard from earlier, the young one, stood stiffly, eyes tired. He straightened when he saw the aide. "Hey," he said. The aide waited. "Thanks," the guard finished, "for earlier. For telling me where to be." "You listened," the aide said. "That's what mattered." The guard nodded, swallowing. The aide pushed through the doors and stepped into morning. Cold air, pale light, a city already moving again. Behind him the hospital continued, reports filed, stories adjusted, facts softened at the edges. No one followed, no one called his name. He walked away carrying nothing but what could not be written down. The sun was fully up now. It sat low over the build. Ings across the street, pale and indifferent, catching on windows and windshields. Morning traffic moved as if nothing unusual had happened overnight. Coffee shops opened, buses hissed at stops. The world resumed without permission. The aide stood across the street from the hospital for a moment longer than necessary. From here, the building looked harmless, glass and concrete. A place people entered expecting help, not decisions that carried weight. No trace of the night showed on the outside. He adjusted the strap of his bag on his shoulder and turned away. 3 blocks down, he stopped at a crosswalk. The signal changed. Cars passed. A siren wailed somewhere far off, already fading. His phone buzzed once in his pocket. He did not take it out. At the corner, a newsstand displayed the early edition. A small headline near the bottom of the page mentioned overnight hospital lockdown. Suspects in custody. No photos, no names, no speculation yet. He kept walking. At a cafe, a nurse from the day shift stood in line ahead of him. Still in clean scrubs, hair neat, eyes unaware. She yawned, checked her phone, smiled at something on the screen. The aide ordered coffee when it was his turn. Black, no lid. The barista handed it over without comment. He took the first sip slowly. Too hot. He welcomed the discomfort. It grounded him. At a small table by the window, he sat and watched the street. His hands were steady now. The weight had settled into its familiar place, present, manageable. Across the street, a ranger convoy idled briefly at a light. Unmarked vehicles, civilian plates, easy to miss if you didn't know what to look for. One of them turned. For a fraction of a second, eyes met through glass and distance. No salute, no nod, the light changed. The vehicles moved on. The aide finished his coffee and stood. He dropped the cup in the bin and stepped back onto the sidewalk. His shift was over. Another would begin soon enough. Somewhere quieter, somewhere that asked less. Behind him, the hospital absorbed the story of the night into procedures and paperwork. The people inside would remember pieces, sounds, moments, a man who moved carts and spoke softly and never asked to be seen. That was enough. He walked until the hospital disappeared behind other buildings, until it was just another place he had passed through. The city closed around him, and the day continued, unaware of how close it had come to breaking.